Let him go, or you'll have to deal with me. The maid's toddler took down the thugs and shocked the entire room. I wasn't going to tell this story, but after what happened inside that mansion, I can't stay quiet anymore. A 3-year-old little girl, barefoot, in a blue tutu dress, standing in the middle of a marble ballroom floor worth more than most people's entire neighborhoods. And she looked at 4 grown men. And she said words that made every single person in that room freeze. Adults dropped to their knees. A woman in a red gown covered her mouth in shock. And the most powerful man in the room, a billionaire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, had tears running down his face. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Because nobody, and I mean nobody, saw this coming from a tiny 3-year-old baby girl. Welcome back, beautiful souls. If this is your first time here, you are in exactly the right place, because on this channel we tell stories that stay with you long after the video ends. Real, emotional, human. The kind that remind you what truly matters in this world. Before we dive in, I want to ask you something. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your country in the comments below. I read every single one, and it always amazes me how far these stories travel. Now, what you are about to hear today is one of the most unexpected, emotional, and jaw-dropping stories I have ever told on this channel. It involves a billionaire, his fiancée, dangerous men, a brave maid, and one tiny 3-year-old little girl in a blue dress who changed everything in a single moment. Stay with me from beginning to end, because the twist in this story, I promise you, you will not see it coming. She was just the maid's little girl. Nobody thought she mattered. They were very, very wrong. His name was Richard Calloway, 43 years old, self-made billionaire. The kind of man whose name appeared in Forbes magazine 3 years in a row. He had built his empire from nothing, literally from a 2-bedroom apartment in Cleveland, Ohio, where he had grown up with a single mother who worked double shifts at a diner just to keep the lights on. Richard never forgot where he came from, even when the world tried to make him forget. By the time he was 43, Richard owned a technology company valued at over $4 billion, a private jet, properties in New York, Miami, and Aspen, and a mansion in the hills of Beverly Hills, California that sat behind iron gates and had more rooms than most people had dreams. But of everything Richard Calloway had in his life, the thing that made him happiest was not the money. It was not the company. It was not the marble floors or the chandelier that cost more than a small house. It was Elena Vasquez, 36 years old. Dark hair, warm brown eyes, a laugh that could fill any room no matter how big it was. She was a landscape architect, the kind of woman who could look at a piece of bare land and see a garden that wasn't there yet. She and Richard had been together for 3 years, and 6 weeks ago, on a quiet Tuesday evening on the rooftop of their favorite restaurant in downtown Los Angeles, Richard had gotten down on one knee and asked her to marry him. She had said yes before he even finished the sentence. The engagement party was planned for a Saturday night in late spring. 200 guests, catered dinner, a live jazz quartet. The mansion's grand ballroom, with its massive twin staircases, its black and white marble floors, its gold-trimmed railings, and its cathedral chandelier, was transformed into something straight out of a fairy tale. But there was one person at that party who was not on the guest list. Her name was Rosie, 3 years old, teeny, with big brown eyes that took in everything around her, and little braids that her mama had done that very morning with a blue ribbon to match her dress. Rosie was the daughter of Carmen Vasquez, Elena's older sister, who had been working as the head housekeeper at Richard's mansion for almost 2 years. Carmen was not just an employee. She was family, Elena's family, which made her Richard's family too. Richard had given Carmen the job when she was going through a brutal divorce and had nowhere to turn. He had converted a small cottage on the property into a home for Carmen and little Rosie, because that was the kind of man Richard Calloway was when the cameras were not rolling and the magazines were not watching. On the night of the engagement party, Carmen was supposed to be working, managing the catering staff, coordinating with the event planner, making sure everything ran perfectly for her little sister's big night. She had arranged for a babysitter to watch Rosie in the cottage. But babysitters sometimes cancel. And Carmen, mid-coordination, had thought Rosie was asleep. She was not asleep. Rosie had woken up, padded across the cottage floor in her bare feet, pushed open the door that the babysitter had not latched properly, and followed the sound of music and laughter across the garden path toward the mansion's back entrance. Nobody noticed the little girl in the blue tutu walking through the service hallway. Nobody noticed her slip through the door into the main foyer. Nobody noticed her standing at the edge of the grand ballroom, her little eyes wide, looking at the chandelier like she had just walked into a dream. 200 guests. Crystal glasses clinking. Soft jazz floating through the air. Richard in a dark navy suit. Elena beside him in a champagne gown. Both of them glowing the way people glow when they are exactly where they are supposed to be in life. Rosie stood at the edge of it all, invisible to everyone. She pressed her tiny back against the wall near one of the gold-trimmed sofas, watching with those enormous eyes. She had never seen anything like this. The lights, the flowers, the music. She did not feel afraid. She felt like she was watching something magical. And then she saw something that didn't fit. 3 men near the back of the room. Not dancing. Not talking to other guests. Not holding champagne glasses. They were standing close together, watching Richard across the room with expressions that even a 3-year-old could somehow feel were not right. Their suits were dark. Their faces were tight. Their eyes were cold in a way that had nothing to do with the party happening around them. Rosie watched them. She did not know what they were planning. She did not know about the business deal that had gone wrong 6 months ago. She did not know about the rival investor who had blamed Richard publicly for a collapse that had cost people millions. She did not know about the threats that Richard's security team had intercepted, or the fact that Richard had refused to cancel the party because he refused to live in fear. She was 3 years old. She did not know any of that. But she watched those 3 men move, slowly, deliberately, toward the back staircase that led to Richard's private office on the 2nd floor. And then she saw a 4th man appear from somewhere near the service entrance. And she saw him nod to the others. She didn't understand what was happening, but she followed them anyway. Because Rosie had learned something in her short 3 years of life, watching her mama work in this house. She had learned that Richard was good. He gave her cookies from the kitchen when her mama wasn't looking. He always crouched down to her level when he talked to her. He called her little boss, because she had once reorganized his entryway shoe rack at age 2.5. And whatever those men were doing, she did not think it was good. The party was still going downstairs. Nobody knew that upstairs, everything was about to fall apart. Richard had slipped away from the party for just a few minutes. That was all it was supposed to be. A few minutes. His business partner, Daniel, had sent him a text saying there was a small issue with one of the documents for the company acquisition they had been finalizing. Nothing that couldn't wait, but Daniel was the kind of man who got anxious, and Richard had always been the kind of man who calmed other people down. So he had whispered to Elena that he would be right back, kissed her on the cheek, and taken the back staircase up to his private office on the 2nd floor of the mansion. He did not notice the men behind him. His office was at the far end of a long hallway on the 2nd floor. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, mahogany desk, 2 leather chairs, a window that looked out over the garden and the glittering lights of the city below. Richard loved that room. It was the one place in the entire mansion where he felt quiet. He had barely sat down when the door opened. He assumed it was Daniel. It was not Daniel. The first man through the door was someone Richard recognized instantly. Victor Crane. 40-something, sharp features. A man Richard had once trusted enough to bring into a business negotiation and later discovered had been feeding information to their competitors for years. Richard had exposed him. Victor had lost everything because of it. Or so Richard had thought. Behind Victor came 3 other men. They were not people Richard recognized. They did not smile. They did not speak right away. They simply positioned themselves around the room like they had rehearsed exactly where each of them would stand. Richard stayed very calm. He had grown up in Cleveland. He had dealt with hard men before. He had learned early that panic never helped anyone, in business or in anything else. He leaned back slightly in his chair and looked at Victor with steady eyes. "Victor," he said, "I see you got an invitation." Victor smiled. It was not a warm smile. "We need to talk, Richard. About what you owe me." "I don't owe you anything," Richard said. "I told the truth. Whatever happened because of that truth was the result of your own choices." The conversation that followed was quiet and controlled on the surface. But there was nothing quiet or controlled underneath it. Victor wanted something. Specifically, he wanted Richard to sign a document. A backdated document that would effectively give Victor a percentage stake in one of Richard's most profitable technology patents. A document that, if signed, would rewrite a piece of financial history and make it look like Victor had been a rightful partner all along. If Richard refused, Victor made clear that the men in the room with him were not going to walk back down those stairs empty-handed. Richard looked at the document. He looked at Victor. He looked at the 4 men positioned around his office. And he said very quietly, "No." One of Victor's men moved toward Richard's desk. 2 others moved toward the door, blocking it. And that was when the small sound came from the hallway. A tiny barefooted sound. A little pattering of small feet on hardwood floor. Everyone in the room paused. Victor turned toward the door, frowning. And then a tiny voice came through. Small, sweet, absolute. The kind of voice that has no idea it should be afraid because it has never yet been taught to be. "Mr. Richard, are you in there?" The room went completely still. Victor looked at the door. He looked at Richard. Something crossed his face. Irritation, calculation, then a decision. "Get rid of whoever that is," he said quietly to the man nearest the door. The man moved toward the door. And Richard, for the first time since this had started, felt something cold move through his chest. 'Cause he knew that voice. That was Rosie. Nobody in that room was ready for what a 3-year-old girl was about to do next. The man pulled open the office door. And there she was. Rosie. 3 years old. Barefoot. Blue tutu dress. Little braids with a blue ribbon. Holding a cookie that she had somehow picked up from a tray downstairs, which she had been eating calmly as she wandered the hallway looking for Richard. She looked up at the large man in the doorway. She looked past him into the room. She saw Richard sitting at his desk. She saw the other men around him. She saw the expression on Richard's face, that controlled, careful expression that adults wear when they are trying very hard not to show that something is wrong. But Rosie had spent the last 2 years watching her mama work in this house. She had watched Carmen read rooms and people the way other people read books. Some of that had transferred to the small person Carmen was raising. Rosie looked at the big man in the doorway. "Excuse me," she said completely seriously. "I need to see Mr. Richard." The man looked down at her the way you look at something you have decided is not relevant. "Go back downstairs, little girl." Rosie did not move. "Mr. Richard," she called past the man louder now. "Are you okay?" Richard's voice came back, and despite everything, it was gentle. "Hey, little boss. You should go find your mama, sweetheart." "Why are all these men in your room?" Rosie asked. She was not whispering. She had the volume of a child who has not yet learned that some questions you are supposed to ask quietly. Victor, from across the room, made a sharp gesture toward the man at the door. "Move her." The man reached down to take Rosie's arm, gently enough, not roughly, simply intending to turn her around and send her back down the hallway. The moment his hand touched her arm, Rosie did something nobody in that room was prepared for. She planted her little bare feet on the hardwood floor, spread both her tiny arms out wide at her sides like a small human barrier, raised her chin, looked directly past the man at the others in the room, and said, in a voice that was loud and clear and rang down that entire hallway, "Let him go, or you'll have to deal with me." The room went silent. Not politely silent. Stunned silent. The kind of silence that happens when something so unexpected occurs that the brain needs an extra second to process that it actually just happened. Victor stared at her. The men stared at her. Richard stared at her. And then something else happened. Something that nobody in that office had calculated, because you cannot calculate a 3-year-old, because a 3-year-old does not know that they are not supposed to be brave. Rosie, still standing with both arms spread wide, turned her head and screamed at the absolute top of her 3-year-old lungs down that hallway. "Mama! Mama, come up here. Mr. Richard needs help. There are bad men's." The sound went through the mansion like a bell. Downstairs in the ballroom, 200 guests heard a child's voice screaming from the floor above them. The jazz quartet stopped. Elena heard her niece's voice. Carmen heard her daughter's voice. And Carmen Vasquez moved through that ballroom faster than anyone had ever seen her move. She hit the staircase at a run with 3 members of Richard's security team, who had been stationed near the ballroom, right behind her because they had also heard it, and they had been trained to respond to exactly that kind of sound. Victor heard the footsteps coming up the stairs. He heard the commotion from below. He looked at Richard. Richard looked back at him, and for the first time all evening, Richard allowed himself the smallest, steadiest smile. "You didn't account for her," Richard said quietly. Victor looked at the tiny 3-year-old still standing in the doorway with her arms spread wide and her cookie in one hand, guarding the entrance to that office like a small, impossibly serious sentinel in a blue tutu. And Victor Crane, a man who had walked into that room believing he held every card, had absolutely no response. Security was up the stairs within 90 seconds. The police were called. Victor and his associates were escorted from the property in handcuffs while 200 guests watched from the entrance of the ballroom below. And through all of it, Rosie stood in that hallway, watching everything with those enormous calm eyes, still holding her cookie. What Richard did next, nobody in that room expected it. And it changed everything. The police came and went. Statements were given. Recordings from the security cameras on the second floor were reviewed. Footage that showed clearly what Victor and his associates had been attempting. Richard's legal team was called. By midnight, Richard had been assured that what had happened that evening would result in serious criminal charges. The engagement party had, in an unexpected way, come to an early close. But here is what happened before the last guests left. After the police had finished with him, after Elena had held his face in her hands in the hallway and checked him over with the focused anxiety of a woman who had come very close to losing someone she loved, after the security team had given their final walkthrough of the property, Richard went looking for Rosie. He found her in the kitchen. Carmen was there, crouched down in front of her daughter, hands on Rosie's small shoulders, speaking to her in a low and trembling voice. Carmen's eyes were wet. She was saying over and over, "Baby, you could have been hurt. You cannot do things like that. You have to come to me. You have to." But Mama, Rosie said with the simple and complete logic of a 3-year-old, Mr. Richard is our family. You always say you protect family. Carmen stopped talking. She pulled her daughter into her arms and held her there, and her shoulders shook, and she pressed her face into Rosie's little shoulder, and she did not say anything for a long moment. Richard stood in the kitchen doorway watching this. He had grown up in Cleveland with a mother who worked double shifts. He knew what it looked like when a woman was holding the weight of everything on her own shoulders. He knew what it looked like when someone loved their child so fiercely it almost broke them. He walked into the kitchen. He crouched down on the floor so he was at Rosie's level, the way he always did when he talked to her, and he looked at this tiny girl in her blue tutu with her blue ribbon slightly askew from all the drama of the evening, and he said, "Hey, little boss." Rosie looked at him. "Hi, Mr. Richard. Are you okay? Because of you." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I'm okay." Rosie considered this with great seriousness and then held out what remained of her cookie. Richard took a small piece of it. He had not been offered a more meaningful gift in recent memory. He stood up. He looked at Carmen, who was still holding Rosie and watching him with reddened eyes. "Carmen," he said, "I need to tell you something." She waited. "I have had this property for 6 years," he said. "And the moment it became a home, a real home, the kind you can feel when you walk through the door, was when you and Rosie were here." He paused. "I want to make some changes. The cottage is too small. I've been thinking about converting the east wing into proper family quarters. Private entrance, full kitchen, everything. I want you and Rosie to have it. Not as an employee benefit. As family." Carmen opened her mouth. No sound came out. "And Rosie's education," Richard continued. "Preschool, school, college, I want to take care of it. All of it. Whatever she needs, wherever her abilities take her." He looked at the small girl in Carmen's arms. "Because anyone who can do what she did tonight at 3 years old, that's someone the world needs to hear from." Carmen put her hand over her mouth. Elena appeared in the kitchen doorway behind Richard, and she had clearly heard at least part of this, because her eyes were bright and she was pressing her lips together the way she did when she was trying not to cry in front of people. "Carmen," Elena said softly. "He's been wanting to say this for weeks. Tonight just moved the timeline up a little." Carmen looked at her sister. She looked at Richard. She looked down at her daughter, who was looking back up at her with those enormous calm eyes, completely unbothered by the magnitude of what was happening, occupied primarily with the remaining portion of her cookie. "She said you were family," Carmen finally managed. "She was right." Richard nodded. "She was absolutely right." And then Rosie, from within the circle of her mother's arms, looked up at Richard with great importance and said, "Mr. Richard, you still have to come back to the party. There is cake." The kitchen erupted in laughter. Real, warm, release, everything laughter. The kind that comes after fear has passed and relief has moved in to take its place. Elena laughed until she pressed her forehead against Richard's shoulder. Carmen laughed through tears. Even 2 members of the security team who had appeared in the doorway laughed. And Richard Calloway, 43 years old, self-made billionaire, man who had built an empire from a 2-bedroom apartment in Cleveland, laughed harder than he had laughed in years. Because a 3-year-old in a blue tutu had just reminded him what all of it was actually for. What happened at that mansion that night made headlines. But the part nobody wrote about was the most important part of all. 2 months passed. Victor Crane and his associates were formally charged. The evidence, including the security footage and witness accounts from the party, was overwhelming. Richard's legal team was confident about the outcome. It was a mess that would take time to fully resolve, but it was a mess that was moving in the right direction. The East Wing renovation was completed 6 weeks after the party. Carmen and Rosie moved in on a Sunday morning. Richard and Elena helped carry boxes, which was not something billionaires typically did on Sunday mornings, but Richard had never been particularly interested in doing things the way billionaires typically did them. Elena had filled Carmen's new kitchen with flowers from the garden. She had designed the garden herself, which meant she knew exactly which blooms Carmen loved most. Rosie walked through every room of the new quarters with a serious inspection of a tiny building assessor. She tested each light switch. She opened and closed every cabinet. She pressed her face against the window that looked out over the garden. Then she turned around and looked at Richard. "This is a good house," she announced. "I'm glad you approve, little boss," Richard said. "I have one question," Rosie said. "What's that? Where is my cookie shelf?" Richard looked at Elena. Elena looked at Richard. Carmen put her face in her hands. That afternoon, Richard drove to a kitchen store in Beverly Hills and returned with the most ridiculous, oversized, impractical cookie jar Rosie had ever seen in her short life. It was shaped like a castle, because she had recently decided that castles were very important, and he installed a dedicated shelf for it in her new room. Elena documented the entire installation on her phone. The photo of Rosie standing on a step stool supervising Richard as he mounted the shelf, arms crossed, expression completely serious, blue ribbon in her hair, became one of Elena's most treasured photographs. She printed it and framed it and put it on the mantel of the main living room, next to the engagement photos and the family portraits. Because that was what Rosie was. Family. Richard and Elena were married the following spring in a small ceremony in the garden of the mansion. The garden Elena had designed herself, with the wisteria climbing the stone walls and the white roses along the path. 200 people had been invited to the engagement party. 30 people were invited to the wedding. Carmen stood beside Elena as her maid of honor. And Rosie, 4 years old by then, impossibly dignified in a white flower girl dress with a blue sash, walked down the aisle ahead of everyone with the focused seriousness of someone who understood the assignment completely. She dropped every single petal individually, one at a time, deliberately. She had apparently been practicing. It took considerably longer than a normal flower girl walk. Nobody minded. At the reception, Richard gave a speech. He talked about Elena. He talked about love and partnership and building a life with someone. He talked about what family meant. Not the family you are born into, but the family you choose, and the family that chooses you back. And then he looked across the room at a 4-year-old girl sitting in a chair that was slightly too big for her, swinging bare feet that did not quite reach the floor, eating a piece of wedding cake with tremendous concentration. "And I want to say," Richard said, voice dropping slightly, "that the bravest person I have ever met in my life is 4 years old." She walked into a room full of danger with nothing but a cookie and an absolute certainty that the people she loved were worth protecting. He paused. "She taught me something that night. That courage is not about knowing you're not afraid. It's about not knowing you're supposed to be." The room was quiet. Rosie, sensing something important had happened, looked up from her cake. She found Richard looking at her. She pointed her fork at him very seriously. "Mr. Richard," she said, "you are crying." "Yeah, little boss," he agreed. "I am." She considered this. "Okay," she decided and went back to her cake. "Here is what I want you to take from this story today." Rosie did not stand in that doorway because she was trained to be brave. She stood there because in her 3-year-old heart, there was no question about what to do when someone you love needs protecting. She had never been taught that courage was something you needed to earn or grow into. She simply loved. And love, when it is real, does not calculate the risk first. We forget that sometimes. We get older and we start measuring. We start asking whether we are capable enough, whether the moment is right, whether we have enough power or influence or resources to matter. Rosie had a cookie and bare feet. It mattered. You already have everything you need. The people in your life who need you are not waiting for you to become stronger first. They need you right now, exactly as you are. Love like Rosie. Be brave like Rosie. And remember, sometimes the smallest person in the room is carrying the biggest heart. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real today, please give it a like. Takes 1 second and it means the world. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because every single week we bring you stories exactly like this one. Emotional, real, human, and unforgettable. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story about courage today, share this with them. You never know whose day you might change. We will see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and take care of each other.